I would invite you this morning, if you would please, to open to the book of 1 Timothy as we continue our trek through this letter that Paul wrote near the end of his life to his protege, young Timothy. So far, as we have started looking at this book, we've discovered an early structure in it that I want to draw your attention to again. Paul, as he does typically in his letters, opens with a greeting where he identifies himself, he identifies who he's writing to, and he writes a prayer in this case, and in most cases, as to what he desires for Timothy to receive, the grace and the mercy and the peace of God. Then Paul turns his attention directly to the subject at hand by urging Timothy to remain in Ephesus and continue the work that they started there. Remember, I made a pretty big deal out of the fact that Paul used the word urged in verse 3 to urge Timothy, to say to him, I want you to stay there. It's your choice, but I want you to stay there because there's important work to be done in that place. Continue what we started. But if you're going to stay, then Paul turns and says, I charge you to address the heterodoxy that has now invaded the church at Ephesus. He urges Timothy to stay, but he commands Timothy to command those who are teaching what is false in the church. Specifically, the advancement of what Paul calls different doctrine. The word different implies that it's different from something. And so what Paul is urging or commanding Timothy to do, charging Timothy to do, is to address the doctrines that are becoming pervasive in the church at Ephesus that are different from what he, Paul, had taught in that place. The apostolic message that he had delivered, which is now being changed by a different doctrine that is now coming, which, as you recall, has led in this church to focuses on things like myths and genealogies and speculations, whatever that is, coming directly out of this false doctrine, coming out of this heterodoxy, and distracting true believers from the teachings which would lead them to what is important, the real goal of orthodoxy. So Paul charges Timothy to command those teaching such heterodoxies to put them aside and return to orthodoxy. Again, Timothy was free to decide if he wanted to stay. It was his choice. But if he did stay, he was to command those who were teaching these false doctrines to stop. Thus, the nature of the charge to Timothy is to address head-on the false teachings in the church. The goal that Paul lays before young Timothy is stay there in that church. Please, stay there in that church and command these people who are not teaching what is consistent with what we have taught as the apostolic message, command them to stop because it's having some dangerous side effects in the lives of those of the church. Now, you remember I said that there was an indicative imperative structure in this book, as there is in all of Paul's letters. It's not as pronounced here as it is in other letters, but it's clearly here. There is a central truth that Paul wishes to address first, and then he'll take that central truth and apply it in certain imperatives later, starting in chapter 2. But here's where we see the central truth from which Paul operates, from which the rest of this letter flows. And you have to get this in order to understand whatever Paul is saying starting in chapter 2. You've got to start with this central truth. Everything else will flow out of it. If you read Timothy from the perspective of trying to read into it what you want it to say, you'll wreck the letter. What you have to do is you have to say, what was Paul's primary point that he's driving at first, which then gives us the background behind all of what comes after that. So here's the indicative. Here's the indicative of this book. The church of Jesus Christ is defined by the boundaries of its doctrinal truth. Okay? There it is. The church of Jesus Christ, the one at Ephesus, the one in Robertsdale, doesn't matter where it is, it's defined by its doctrinal boundaries. For Paul, this is the key subject which stands at the very center of this letter and all that he's going to say in it. The Church of Jesus Christ is not defined by so many of the things that define the church today. Paul would find so many of the things that define the modern church to be utterly preposterous. In fact, I would argue that Paul would probably walk into our churches of our day and he would call them wicked. He wouldn't just call them preposterous. Churches that define themselves by their warmth, or define themselves by their success, or define themselves by their size, or define themselves by what they offer, or define themselves by their relevance. Now you'll notice all 5 of those terms are terms that are plastered all over the web pages of churches in America today. This is what we offer. This is what we are. We're a church that's warm. We're a church that's big. We're a church that's got many things to offer you, etc., etc. That's how churches define themselves. Paul would look at that and shake his head and go, no, 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 no. The church is defined by what it believes. The church is defined by its doctrinal statement. It's defined by the truths of Scripture that it encapsulates, and defines itself by the boundaries of orthodoxy. I saw this week that John MacArthur has once again waded into the abyss. He's not afraid to do so, apparently. He started a blog series, just the introduction this week. How many read the introduction to the blog series? A few of you, okay. If you haven't, I'd definitely Google it and go read it, all right? Because Dr. MacArthur has decided to wade into the issue of social justice. And Dr. MacArthur believes that social justice as a defining attribute of the church is unbiblical and against the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now notice I just added a term to my list. We are a church that embraces social justice. We're out there at the front lines of the things that need to be challenged in our society. Is that what defines a church? And the answer is no, no, no. What defines the church of Jesus Christ is the apostolic message, the apostolic church. And we could flip that little principle over and say it this way: the church ceases to be the church when it embraces something other than apostolic truth. The church stops being the church when it decides that something other than the orthodox apostolic teaching handed down by the apostles and contained in our scriptures and made alive by the Spirit of the living God is embraced. Something other than that, we stop being the church. Those are big words, isn't it? It takes a lot of guts for me to say that. Actually, it doesn't. Because, truth doesn't take a whole lot of effort to say. The fact of the matter is the church is defined by the scriptural realities released by the apostles. Thus, in the imperative section of the book, starting in chapter 2, Paul will take up various structural matters that will hinge on this reality. Let me give you an example. When he talks about eldership in chapter 3, he's not talking about eldership simply in the sense of, well, you really ought to have elders in your church and they ought to be good guys that know how to teach, and if you do this, then your church will be structured properly. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is this: you put elders in place who will hold fast to this truth. Put men in place who are going to hold those boundaries. And if they're not holding those boundaries, then kick them out. Okay? So in other words, it's not a structural matter at all. It's a doctrinal matter. And so Paul is here giving to Timothy this great charge. Go to these men and make them stop teaching what is false. Because if you do not do that, you are allowing the church to no longer be the church. That's how important Paul considered this issue. Paul considers this so important, he's putting the very existence of the church itself on the line. Do you understand that? Do you see what he's doing here? He's saying, listen, you can call yourself a church and have a nice pretty little logo that you print on your visitor cards, but you know what? It doesn't mean squat if your church isn't sound doctrinally, apostolically sound. This is the hinge of the book. So we see the charge. The charge is go to those men who are teaching heterodoxy and stop them. But why? Okay, now go to verse 5. Verse 5, Paul is going to now give the aim of the charge. Notice what he says. The aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. All right, we'll just stop right there because that's as far as we're going to get today. The goal or target of this charge to Timothy, why? What's the purpose behind such a myopic focus? Tunnel vision Paul has here. Right to this issue, right here. This is it. This is it. This issue, this guy right here, this person right here who is teaching something other than what we revealed, that guy's the problem. All right, so what's the aim? What's the goal? What's the purpose here? Why? I would have you note something here before we begin looking at this verse per se. Notice that the ESV translated as the aim of our charge. That's interesting, isn't it? The article here is actually an article that could just be translated the. But the ESV chooses to use the word our, and I think that's right. I think so. And the reason is that even though it's a singular word in the Greek, it's reasonable to translate it this way because Paul would have considered the charge that he just gave to Timothy to be the same charge he himself labored under while he was there. So he could say, this is our charge, okay? Timothy, understand something. I'm sending you in to deal with the heterodoxy, but that's what I was doing when I was there, okay? So this is our charge. And I think that's a good translation of that. I mean, if we're going to be literal about it, it really should be the, but I think the idea is right. The ESV translators, I think, did this correctly. Now, what is the aim then? The aim, Paul says, is love. Love, right? The aim of our charge is love. The aim of this goal is love. Now, we'll step back from that phrase. And in both English and Greek, there's some question as to how Paul is attempting to use this phrase, because there's two ways to understand what Paul could be saying here. In the first sense, he could be saying, the aim of our charge is you loving each other by hearing these things. The other way is he could be saying, us loving you by telling you these things. Okay, so it depends on your focus here. Okay, so let's start and look at either one of them to see what he might be meaning. The first is this idea. Our aim is love. Love that you would have as Orthodox believers, as those embracing sound doctrine, the love that you would have for each other by hearing these things. Okay. In this case, Paul is simply saying that proper doctrine in the church leads to a true sense of love among its members. Now, at this point, I'm going to insert the entire series that I did from Ephesians right here. I'm not going to repeat the sermons, but that was the point, you remember, of the book that Paul wrote, the letter that Paul wrote, the encyclical that Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, right? Remember how much time we talked about loving each other and the true love of what it means and how that all fed together? Well, Paul's coming right back to the same subject again. He's saying our goal as followers of Christ is to love one another. We should be loving each other in tangible, concrete, and real sort of ways, but that love must be based on truth. Paul's right in this sense. He says the gospel, the true gospel, leads to humility before others, does it not? If we understand what Jesus Christ has really done, we don't walk up to somebody else and say, look how special I am. No, rather we say, look how special he is. I'm worthless. He's what matters. It produces genuine humility. It stimulates compassion for each other. We say, just as Christ had compassion on me, I will turn and have compassion upon someone else. in their time of need. The true gospel of Jesus Christ expresses truthfulness before others. We will not allow our brother or sister to continue in his falsehood, which is precisely, of course, what Paul is saying to Timothy here. And then finally, and I think most importantly, the true gospel of Jesus Christ promotes sacrifice rather than self-centeredness. Sacrifice. Just as we look at this Christ, who did not think that it was robbery to keep his position before God, but rather took on human flesh, stepped down from that eternal position to become as one of us, and then even to go to a cross and die. That's sacrifice. Beyond our comprehension, to be honest with you. So when we look to this Christ, we see sacrifice, which should lead us to a sense away from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. You see, this is what the gospel does. This is what the true message of the apostolic faith does. It leads to humility. It leads to compassion. It leads to truthfulness. It leads to sacrifice. And I could add a dozen other words, I suppose, in there. This is what the true gospel of Christ does. So sound doctrine fundamentally is Christocentric, Christ-centered. True doctrine is Christ-centered. The orthodoxy that Paul is talking about is a focus upon this Christ. Who is he? What has he done? And what does it mean to me? In the sense of who is this Christ and what has he done? Because it's not really about me at all. It's not about you. It's about him. So it's Christocentric. When we focus our understanding upon Jesus Christ, we cannot help but love others as he has loved us. A genuine understanding of the gospel leads to a love for others. I mean, after all, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus himself said, right? Love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And love him with everything you've got. And then go love your neighbor as yourself. Well, you're not going to do the second one if you're not doing the first. If you're not loving God with everything that you have, you're not going to love your neighbor as yourself. But if you are loving God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you will naturally, by extension, love your neighbor. It flows one from the other. But here's the problem. False doctrines, heterodoxy, those things that are not consistent with the apostolic message, they lead to an unloving spirit permeating the church. This is the part that many people don't get. This is the part that's overlooked. False teachings, that which is not consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ as revealed in the Scriptures, is fundamentally selfish. It's fundamentally selfish. As I sat in my office this week, I tried to think about the various ways that this is true, as I've perceived it in the church over the years, that I've seen people who love to dabble in what is untrue. And consistently, you could see in their lives a sense of selfishness. Paul will give a number of examples in this very book. Paul will give a number of examples throughout this book. I could have written many more. I'm only going to give you a couple here. Down in verse 7, he talks about this idea of people who who desire to be teachers of the law, but they're out without understanding. In other words, they're promoting themselves as great teachers of others. And who's getting the glory for that? They are. In chapter 4, in the first 3 verses, these are people who will establish legalisms that promote selfish power over others. The Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving, etc. What are they doing? You will follow my rules. I'm making the rules around here, and from now on, here's what you're going to do, and here's what you're not going to do. Well, who's being promoted here? Me. I'm the lawgiver. I'm the one that's deciding. Notice what false doctrine does. It leads to a sense of self. It turns the attention away from Christ to us, a sense of automatic selfishness. Paul's going to talk about it in chapter 5 when he talks about the unmarried widows list, the selfish fleshly passions that such women have, down in verses 11 and 12 of chapter 5. And then finally, near the very end of the book, in chapter 6 and verses 3 through 5, he's going to talk about those who teach different doctrine, and becomes, in verse 4, puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy. Oh, I love that phrase. How many people have I seen over the years in churches who just love the controversy? And they'll pick at every little bit of doctrine or whatever that they can, with the necessary goal, of course, for us to look at them and to say, wow, isn't he smart? Look at this one. He can pick apart anything, but it's selfish in the end. See, here's what Paul's going to do. Look carefully at what Paul does in this book. Paul will attribute these attitudes and teachings, now get this, to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, chapter 4, verse 1, or, in chapter 5, verse 15, straying after Satan. No. MacArthur's no Paul, because MacArthur's not going to attribute the teachings that he's attacking to the devil, but Paul did. Here's what Paul is saying. Listen, he's not mincing any words here. He's saying, listen, this stuff is from the pit of hell. It has come into this church from the devil himself. Satan himself is bringing this stuff into the church. Because the best way to destroy the church of Jesus Christ is not from opposition from the outside, but from division on the inside. Just get this group to go one direction and this group to go the other. You wish you were sitting on the other side now, don't you? And guess what happens? You win. You create factions and selfishness and people who won't listen to authorities and people who won't embrace what is true, but rather will go their own way. Paul says that's right from the pit of hell. This is such an important topic to the Apostle Paul that he's willing to call it out in that way. So we ought not to take it lightly, obviously, because Paul certainly doesn't. Paul could be saying here, the aim of our charge is that you love one another. That you're not divided from one another, that you're not split up over little things like this. You don't allow the devil a foothold in the church. Love each other. Be consistent. Be selfless, humble, sacrificial, all those kinds of things. Paul could be saying the point of this charge, the aim of this charge, the purpose, Timothy, is to get these people to love each other. And he's right, isn't he? Because if you remove the division, guess what you have? You have unity. So that's one way that Paul could be speaking of it, and I think he's certainly right in that sense. But there's a second possibility, and that is that Paul could be saying it is loving to tell others of this, meaning the aim of the charge, Timothy, is for you to love them enough to tell them the truth. Us loving you, that is Paul and Timothy loving you by telling you these things. Now, you and I both know we stand at a day in which it is absolutely and unequivocally unloving to tell someone the truth. Our entire culture is built around this reality today, and it's tearing itself apart. Make no mistake about it, this is the fundamental issue of our day. It is inherently unloving to speak truth to those who wish to remain blissfully ignorant. In fact, now any attempt to actually speak truth will result in open hostility. The worst responses, go read the comments, the worst responses that MacArthur got just to his introduction came from people claiming to be followers of Christ. How dare you speak to us this way? No, that's unloving to say such things. Oh, now he's Pope MacArthur. Really? You see? People who don't want to be challenged in their ignorance, their, in fact, stupidity, their lack of understanding, their inability to think. This is the world in which we live. But look, here's what you must never forget, okay? Let me just burst a little bubble in you for just a moment if I could. The gospel of Jesus Christ has always been offensive. Okay? Now don't say amen. And here's why. Because that's going to scare you if you really want to say amen to that. The gospel of Jesus Christ was never designed to be a message that the world would just say, hey, that sounds nice. It was designed to be a message that would offend. When you speak of the gospel of Jesus Christ, if you have not offended your neighbor, you probably haven't told them the truth. The gospel is offensive. It's so offensive that the greatest seeker-sensitive movement in the world failed. You say, what seeker-sensitive movement was that? I'm not talking about Bill Hybels, although that did fail, and spectacularly, as we're discovering. But rather, it comes out of Jesus himself. In John chapter 6. So many followed him, you remember, around the lake. They wanted a meal. They got one. Jesus took a few loaves and some fishes and turned it into a meal fit for a crowd. And they ate and they were comfortable with it and they enjoyed it. And during the night while they're asleep, he walked back across to Capernaum. He took a shortcut. He walked across the lake rather than, walking around the land. Shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, right? So he just went across the lake. And his disciples rode away after him as he went over there. Well, the crowd woke up in the morning, and guess what they needed again? A meal, right? They needed breakfast. And Jesus wasn't around. But someone told him, well, he left. He went back to Capernaum. And so they headed around the north side of the lake, and they eventually caught up with him there, and there he was. And he didn't offer him another meal. What he did say to them is, if you want to be my disciples, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. Long story short, they all left. They all left. And Jesus turned to his disciples at this point, and I like the way one translation puts it. Does this offend you? Does this offend too? Do you take offense at this? And in verse 66, it says these words, after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. Isn't that fascinating? Disciples, right? People who supposedly were all in. But they weren't all in because they got offended by one little thing that he said, one little thing. And I could argue that they got offended not only for the one little thing, but for the one little thing they didn't get, which was another meal. Look, we should know this as core to the substance of the gospel. It is fundamentally unloving to allow people in the church to continue to embrace false teachings, because those false teachings will eventually lead them to ruin. Do you understand what I just said here? You realize the ramifications of what I just said here? It is unloving to allow people to continue to embrace what is false. It's unloving to do that. We must be ready to confront what is in error. Now, when Peter says always be prepared to give an answer, he says, but to do so with gentleness and reverence. Okay, so there should be gentleness and reverence in our holding one another accountable. There's no doubt of that. But to just say, you know what, couple A over here, they've got some really bizarre views of the faith, but that's okay. We'll just leave them. They're okay. It's unloving to do that. And I think that's one of the things that Paul might be saying here. Our charge, the aim of our charge is love. What's our goal? To love enough to tell the truth. To say, listen, continuing down this path of believing these things is going to bring you to destruction. Don't go there. Don't go there. Now you'll notice, I didn't say anything about practices or beliefs or sins even here. I'm not even talking about that stuff. Yeah, we should hold one another accountable to sin. But what Paul is talking about here is holding one another accountable to truth. To what is true. More even than holding one another accountable to a certain set of practices and sins, okay? Because I would argue, and Paul would argue as well, that if you don't get the truth part right, there's no point in confronting somebody about the sin that they're embracing. Because it's more than likely true that their sin simply flows out of the fact that they believe something wrongly. So Paul says, our charge is love. Whether that love be a love for one another in the church or us loving you to tell you the truth, doesn't matter. They're both the same thing. Our job is to be loving. Our goal is to be loving enough to say, listen, this is the core of the gospel. This is the message of Christ, and these are the boundaries that Paul laid out in the gospel under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, and it is not acceptable to go outside these boundaries and introduce heterodoxy into the life of the church. But Paul then says, in the second half of the verse, he says, the aim of our charge is love. Now notice the next phrase, that issues from. Okay, so he's going to tell us what the origin then is of this love. What's the origin of this charge? Where is it coming from? He says, it's love that issues from. Now, it's either coming, this word issues from. The issues from is coming out of, coming from, the source of it. You could say where it originates. Okay, where's this love originating? What's the source, the genesis, the beginning of this love that we have? Okay? So, depending on our view of love from the previous discussion, either things that will be true of believers, as they love each other, or things that are true of Timothy and Paul as they speak and are justified to speak as they do. Okay, so what is the origin within either the church itself as they love each other, or the origin of it as it comes out of Paul and Timothy to the church? Paul says first, it's a love that issues from a pure heart. The very first sermon I ever heard as a believer, sometime in the late 1980, I don't remember the exact date, but sometime in late 80, very first sermon that I heard after I became a believer, my friend invited me to a Baptist church in Edina, Minnesota, a small little church, little Baptist church there. And the very first sermon that I heard was by a guest speaker who was preaching on John 17. And I remember the sermon vividly because we got a copy of the cassette and played it again and again and again, so I get a lot of it still running around in my head. But one of the things that this man talked about was this idea of a pure heart. A pure heart. When we talk about a pure heart, we're talking about a purity or cleanness of desire. A passion to know and do what is right. The heart of a person is the control center of a person. The heart is the control center of a man. It's the very nature within us from which all of our thoughts and our emotions and our will emanate. It's who we are, underline that word, are, at the very core of our existence. It's what defines us. Ontologically speaking, our heart is that which we are. What are we? At our very heart. We know that in our fallen state, in our unregenerate state, our nature is desperately corrupt and wicked. As God says through Jeremiah, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Who can know it? Who can understand it? Who can understand this? Well, humans can't, but God says, I can, I know it. Jesus himself in Matthew 15 says, but those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man. What defiles the man? That which comes out of the heart. Not which comes out of the mouth, what comes out of the heart. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts and murder, and he gives a whole list of them, because they are the actions springing forth from a nature. We kill each other because we're killers. That's what we are. The heart is desperately wicked, corrupted, and evil in our fallen state. But the good news is that when God regenerates a man and raises him from the dead, he graciously grants that man a new heart, a new nature. You remember Ezekiel 11 and Ezekiel 36. God says, I will take out the heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh, and I will write my law upon their heart, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. The difference is that the nature of the regenerate man is such that the law of God is not written on stone outside of him, it's written on the flesh inside of him. In regeneration, God gives us this new heart. So this love is proceeding from a new heart, which Paul calls a pure heart. That word pure, by the way, is the word catharsis. Anybody here ever had a cathartic? Anybody here know what a cathartic is? In our day, we have, how to explain this in ways that don't offend the young ears. We send 50-year-old men away to have a colonoscopy. The event immediately preceding a colonoscopy is called a cathartic. Okay, now those of you who understand my medical language will know what I'm talking about, right? And I'm not going any further with that. But it's a cleansing, isn't it? That's what he's talking about here. A pure heart is a heart that has been cleansed, emptied of anything that is evil within it. An elimination of the harmful to leave behind the pure. This is what David prays for in the great repentant psalm, Psalm 51. Create in me a clean, a cathartic heart. Give me a heart that's pure, because the one I have sins in such a way as I have sinned. David knows that his problem is not the fact that he has external temptations. Paul knows that his problem is his heart. He knows that his fundamental nature is such that he could decide not to go to war like kings are supposed to, but stay home and fantasize about the woman across the street. He knows that his problem is with his heart. But again, in regeneration, God puts within us a nature that loves truth, that desires what is good because it is based on truth. Paul says that this genuine Christian love, this love we either have for one another or that we have in speaking truth to someone else, whichever way you want to look at it, this love issues from a nature that is made pure by a true understanding of Jesus Christ. And you see how I put it? An understanding of this Christ. Who is he? What has he done? And how does it apply to the church and to me? It's not a selfish nature still focused on what's false, because that's what the unregenerate heart has, a focus on what is false. The unregenerate heart loves fake news. If I could borrow a term from our day. Fake news, which, by the way, is an oxymoron in itself, isn't it? But that's what the human heart desires. Don't tell me the truth. Or as someone once said, my mind is made up, don't confuse me with the facts. Think about that for a second. I'll give you a second. Right? My mind's made up, don't confuse me with the facts. But that's what the unregenerate heart is. The pure heart, the heart that truly loves, produces love inside the church, is a love based on truth. It's based on the embracing of what is real, what has been revealed. Not what we feel is right. What we know is right, given what is revealed. And Paul says this also comes from a good conscience. A conscience is a unique faculty in humans. We are the only creatures on the planet who have a conscience. A conscience is that sense within us in which we apprehend the moral demands of God and realize shame and guilt when we violate them. Conscience within us is that sense that we know what is right and what is wrong as defined by God. I mean, even Paul puts it this way at the end of Romans 1 when he says that all those who practice wickedness know that these things deserve death. They know that. They don't care. Their consciences have been seared or cauterized or rendered inoperative. In fact, Paul's going to say that to Timothy even in this very book in chapter 4, verse 2. That in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared. They don't care if they tell you what is untrue. They don't care. A good conscience is one in which we are able to still apprehend what God has said is true and what is good and what is right, and we do it. We apprehend it, and we're not covered in shame and guilt and breaking away from it. So what Paul is saying here, that this love does not just issue from a pure heart, it issues from a good conscience as well. It issues from an awareness of and love of the law of God. What has God said? What does God say? It doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what I believe. It doesn't matter what you believe. It only matters what He believes. In the end, it only matters what He believes. And so a good conscience says, I want to know what God's Word says. I don't want to be filled up with shame and guilt when I'm discovered to have violated the law of God. A good conscience is not a selfish desire to sin regardless of how it hurts others or myself. Because that's what the unregenerate man does. An unregenerate man does not care. He has no shame or guilt in himself. So it's out of a pure heart this love emanates. This love emanates out of a good conscience. But it also, Paul says, issues from a sincere faith. A sincere, genuine faith. One that's without hypocrisy. Sincere is without hypocrisy. Or one word that is used in the lexicon is unfeigned. Unfeigned. You know what that means? It means real. Real. So much of our day today is nothing but a masquerade. I'm sorry. There's too much which masquerades as faith. There's too much that masquerades as Christianity. There's too much that masquerades as the church. There's too much that pretends to really love this Jesus and to love the law of God, which really doesn't. Which is the exact problem that Paul's addressing, right? A false faith, a faith based on false doctrine, is an outward profession only. It's a feigning of true belief, masquerading behind all the right words. Ever met someone like that? They have all the right words. They can quote you Christianese language just like this. Just pops out of their mouth like you can't even imagine, right? They've got all the spirituality. They've got it tied up in a nice little bow. They can give you all the right words, and you look at their lives and go, how come their lives don't match how they speak? It's a masquerade. It's a feigning. False doctrine creates insincerity by definition. It demands no genuine conversion. False doctrine doesn't demand any lasting or radical trust in Christ. It's a doctrinal system, Paul says, is based on, his own words, speculations. It leads to a life of hypocrisy. If you were put on trial for being a Christian, let me rephrase that. When you are put on trial for being a Christian, Will there be enough evidence from your day-to-day life to convince a jury that your actions are a result of your commitment to Christ? Will there be enough evidence to say, well, let's look at his or her life and let's try to figure out whether they really belong to this Christ or not? Genuine Christian love. Again, this kind of love that Paul is talking about issues from a faith that is built on an understanding of truth and a desire to live that truth. Not some sort of selfish sense of trust only in oneself. Yes, I believe in Jesus, but I'm trusting in myself to get myself to heaven, or to get myself into the good graces of my church or my pastor or whatever it is that I've set up as the authority over myself other than Christ himself. This is the mark of all these various kinds of false gospels that run today. Going back to our original statement then, the church is to be defined, my word, defined, by a love that emanates from a truly converted people who strive for holiness and a clear conscience while holding fast to a faith built on truth. The foundation is truth. I mean, even Paul's going to say it later in this letter, right? The church is the pillar and foundation of what? The truth. Genuine love, real love for one another, the kind of love that actually confronts error, the kind of love that actually promotes more love, is a love that says, we know what this gospel is because it's been revealed. We study it, we learn it, we grow in our understanding of it, and as we grow in that understanding, the hypocrisy of our lives and the guilt and shame of our consciences and the decisions that come out of our heart turn more and more and more to this Christ. See it? The aim of the charge to Timothy isn't go make a perfect church. The aim of the charge is go make a church built on truth. Built on the essence of truth. Now let me pause and note here something. It's not a pause. It's the core. These, now get this, these are the very characteristics of Christ himself. Jesus himself, the man who walked around in Galilee, the one who walked across that lake. These are the characteristics of him. He's the one who possessed the very nature of God. Did Jesus have a pure heart? More pure than any of ours. And yet at the same time, we possess a purity of heart identical to his. In our justification, in our trust of this Christ, he sees us now fully pure as his own Son. He lived a life of pure holiness. Did Jesus ever have a conscience that bothered him? Was there ever a time when Jesus thought to himself, oh, I'm filled with such shame for the decision I just made, the thought I just had? No. He does not possess that nature, that conscience that we do that's filled with guilt and shame. And yet, Paul argues in Romans 8, does he not? That we can possess a conscience that's free of guilt and shame as we pursue after this Christ. So he had a pure heart, he had a clear conscience, and he had a sincere faith. In what? What did this Jesus trust in more than anything else? Trusted in the plan of his Father in the work that he was going to do. When his Father told him, I want you to enter into this world and take on the likeness of men, and I want you to go to a cross, and I want you to be killed, I will raise you up. I will give you back the glory that you had with me before the foundations of the world. And the Son entered into his world, his Father's world. He took on the likeness of sinful flesh. He went to that cross and he died. And his Father kept his word and raised him up from the dead and seated him in the position of power at the right hand of the Father. Gave him all that he had. When Jesus was walking around in the face of this world, he had such a solid trust in what his Father had promised him to do that he was able to look at the religious leaders of the day and tell them the truth. Get it? Truth comes out of this. A sincere faith, a pure heart, a clean conscience are the very characteristics of Jesus himself. The church is the church of Christ. It's not the church of me or the church of anyone else. It's the church of Christ. It's his church. And therefore, all of us should be emulating him in every aspect of our existence, including our absolute insistence on what is true. He spoke the truth. He trusted his Father's plan. He lived a life of holiness without a conscience problem. He had a purest of heart because he had the purest of motives. He had the purest of love. He is the embodiment of this love. When we talk about Christ loving us, we're talking about that being true.